Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Roderick Norman. I'm a Chief Partnership Officer in the firm department, the Resource Mobilization and Partnerships department. And I'm pleased to host today's webinar, the last in our series of climate finance focused brown bags. As you know, this series is meant to highlight and showcase the best practices, lessons learned, and next innovations in our trust fund platform. So we're happy to be joined today with our two colleagues from the bank, Rita Effa, as well as Leandro Acevedo, who are both climate finance officers in the Climate Finance and Green Growth Department of the bank. They'll be speaking about the funds that they run respectively. We'll start with Rita and then Leandro. Rita is the coordinator of the Africa Climate Change Fund, which gives small grants to climate readiness, adaptation and mitigation, as well as capacity building in the climate-related sector. Leandro is a part of the climate investment funds, which oversees a portfolio of over $1 billion of climate-related projects. So each of them has deep domain expertise. We're looking forward to their comments. Just in terms of housekeeping, each speaker will have 30 minutes and then 30 minutes of questions. If you have questions, you have an icon at the bottom, a Q&A icon that you can click on and ask your question. We'll take some questions during the presentation, but the majority will take after they have given their prepared remarks. So with that, Rita, let me turn it over to you to begin.
Thank you very much, Roderick, for this introduction. My name is Rita Effa, and I'm the coordinator for the Africa Climate Change Fund. It is my pleasure today to present to you the important work of the Africa Climate Change Fund. As Roderick mentioned, the Africa Climate Change Fund is a multi-donor trust fund within the bank, and it is placed within the Climate Change and Green Growth Department of the bank. It is a multi-donor trust fund that gives out small grants to regional member countries to support climate finance readiness activities, and also to support countries to access climate change funds from the Green Climate Change Fund, from the Adaptation Fund. Throughout the past few weeks, you've heard from several colleagues from the Climate Finance Division, and essentially the Africa Climate Change Fund plays a key role in helping countries to prepare projects to access climate change funds. My presentation will take this shape. I will run through this try to do it within 30 minutes, and we will have some time for questions and answers. I hope to be able to share a little bit more about what this fund is doing, and also to answer some of your questions about how to access the fund. So in 2014, the fund was established. It was established as a bilateral trust fund, and in 2017, it was converted into a multi-donor trust fund. It currently has a size of about $22 million. And the focus, as I've mentioned already, is to support countries, mostly our regional member countries, to access climate change finance. And in some cases also to develop small-scale adaptation projects to build resilience of vulnerable communities. The way the fund is structured is like, unlike the other climate change funds, it launches periodically calls for proposals. So already we've had 2 calls for proposals, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. and also share with you some exciting news, I hope, of the upcoming third call for proposals and what the focus of that will be. The fund disburses grants between $250,000 to $1 million per grant. And as I said, it's accessible to governments, and also important to note, it's also accessible to non-governmental organizations within our regional member countries, as well as regional institutions. We have 5 main donors. We have GIZ, Government of Flanders, Government of Italy, and 2 new additions, which we are really excited about, is the Global Affairs Canada and the Government of Quebec, who recently joined the fund and making some significant contributions to help us keep up the important work of the fund. I also would like to highlight that the Government of Flanders also replenished the fund this year. As I mentioned earlier, for you to be able to access the fund, we usually launch calls for proposals. And the calls for proposals so far, the areas of intervention or the focus so far has been in 2 main categories. Supporting direct access to climate finance, where we provide support to develop bankable projects which are aligned to countries' nationally determined contributions, or what we call climate action plans, and then the national adaptation plans, as well as to support institutional strengthening of our regional member countries to access climate change funds. And then the second area of intervention is supporting small-scale or pilot adaptation initiatives with the focus on building community resilience. Here, we support small-scale projects which look at promoting access to clean energy, climate resilient agriculture, water, and sanitation. Let me go back here, and I think I've mentioned this already. We are expecting, once approved by the Oversight Committee of the Fund, we are expecting to launch a 3rd call for proposal somewhere in November. And the focus of that call for proposal is on gender and climate resilience. And also, we are also exploring the idea of having a demand-driven window, in which, unlike the calls for proposal, the focus of the demand-driven window really would be on a need-by-need cases. So if we have a regional member country requiring support for instance, one thing that is coming up now for most African countries is a revision of their nationally determined contributions. So such a window will have that flexibility, of course, with an agreed set of criteria to allow our regional member countries not to wait for the next call for proposal, but to be able to access the fund. Our objectives are these, but I want to put it in context a little bit. One thing we know, and you probably heard this from previous colleagues, is that African countries, yes, have access to all these climate funds, but often the challenge for most African countries is having the capacity or even the resources to be able to develop bankable proposals or projects which will receive funding from these climate change funds. So within this context, the Africa Climate Change Fund plays a key role in supporting climate finance readiness activities. And so this is really the main objective of the fund, as well as to support institutional strengthening of our regional member countries to be able to not only develop proposals, but once they are approved, to be able to implement them effectively. So I just want to leave you with these 2 main thoughts, because that is really what the fund is all about. So you may ask yourself, who is eligible to access funding from the Africa Climate Change Fund? Well, the good news is that the bank internally, the bank departments can access the fund. They can access it by submitting a proposal directly, or they can work with eligible external beneficiaries to support them to develop proposals which can be submitted to the fund. On the other hand are the external beneficiaries, which involves African government. In here, it's not only government ministries, but you can have subnational, local, and municipal governments applying to the fund directly. And also we have Africa regional organizations, intergovernmental organizations, or from the private sector. On a case-by-case basis, as we have it now, we may have UN agencies applying to the fund, and we have, in fact, we have one with UNCDF for projects in Lesotho and Benin. On the other hand, African funds, which are legally registered on the continent, can apply. But the only drawback here is that if it's a private sector fund and it's a for-profit fund, it cannot, at this point, access funds from the ACCF. We also have Africa regional research institutions that can also access funds, but they must also demonstrate some track record and credibility. So this is, in brief, the process we go through to get a proposal submitted and then all the way to project closure. It starts with when we launch the call for proposals, and then there is a 30-day period for the project developers or the executing agency to submit a project concept note. The Secretariat receives it, it pre-screens it, and then it pre-screens it based on what is outlined as the focus areas of that particular call for proposal. And then once they've shortlisted that particular concept note, the project developers will have to submit a full proposal, following which the Secretariat will review the proposal, ensure that it meets the needs of the fund, what has been outlined, and then it passes it on to the technical committee. The technical committee also reviews, approves, and then forwards it to the oversight committee, which is basically representatives of our donors for their final review and approval. When all of this is successful, we have a grant agreement signed between the bank and the executing agency. The bank visits the beneficiaries, but in this case, we are having virtual missions for good reasons. And so in this launch mission, what our objective is to introduce the executing agency to the bank procurement processes and what they need to do to know about processes, internal processes to guide and aid the project implementation. When all is good, we continue on to implementation. There is a biannual reporting to the ACCF. And then finally, when it's good and done, there is project closure. Typically, our projects have a time period of 2 years. We have a few instances where they go beyond that, but we've had some challenges with the disbursements from the funds, which I will not get into, but slowly, I think we are getting there. The governance structure of the ACCF, as you can see it here, consists of the Oversight Committee, who are the representatives of our donors. They give strategic guidance and direction to the fund. They also approve funding proposals from above $500,000 all the way to more than $1 million. We also have in between them and the Secretariat, we have the technical experts from the bank, and this consists of various bank departments, agenda, climate change, and green growth. We have firm represented and other bank, relevant bank departments. And their support to the fund really helps the fund to be able to manage its activities efficiently. So they also approve projects up to 500,000 and also review projects which are more than 500,000 and they pass them on to the Oversight Committee for approval. At the bottom is us, myself and my colleagues, and we run the day-to-day activities of the fund. On the other hand, which I also want to focus on as we have more and more bank departments receiving support from the ACCF, is that we also require operational support from tax managers. So besides where, beyond where the bank, a tax manager and a department applies for funding from the ACCF, where they are required, of course, to manage that particular project like we do with our external beneficiaries. On the other hand, where we have external beneficiaries within the countries where we have the bank's country offices, we often reach some sort of arrangement or agreement with the country offices and the regional offices. to seek the support of tax managers or assign tax managers to projects which are being implemented by external entities. And that is also one way that we really engage other bank departments. And this is really valuable to us because it really helps to deliver the projects as planned. Here, I would like to highlight broadly where the ACCF projects exist and what we are doing across the continent. It is a small fund, but I think of it as a mighty fund because it really has a catalytic role to play. As you can see, we are almost everywhere but Northern Africa. And for here, I want to highlight two things or three things. From the first call for proposals, we have about 8 projects that were approved across the continent with a funding envelope of 3.3 million to finance climate readiness activities. And then from the second call for proposals, we have 7 new additional projects joining the fold to make it 15. And these projects also focusing on climate finance readiness activities and some focusing on small-scale climate adaptation initiatives with mitigation co-benefits. We also have, currently, we are reviewing 3 projects in our pipeline, which will be added on to the second call for proposals. Here, I would like to briefly mention, it's important that having given you an overview to mention broadly some of our achievements, which we are very proud of. We have to date developed 17 concept notes targeted to the Green Climate Change Fund, Green Climate Fund, and the Adaptation Fund. And out of these 17 concept notes, we have 6 fully fledged proposals developed. They are in different phases of approval. We have some approvals, and then we are also hoping that by the end of this year, we'll have even more, estimated at about over $55 million. So, and also we provide, as I mentioned, institutional capacity strengthening. So to date, since most of these, by the way, most of these achievements are from the first call for proposals, the second call for proposals activities are now rolling in. So we'll have even more achievements to report in the future. We have also supported 1 national institution here in Cote d'Ivoire to be able to be accredited to access funding from the Green Climate Change Fund. I will not get into the details of this, but this slide is aimed to also share with you that our 2019 annual report is finalized. We presented it to our oversight committee, and once we receive their final clearance, it will be published widely, and that will be one good source for tax managers, for people who are new to the bank or who want to know more about the funds to really know what we are doing on a country-by-country cases, on a project-by-project basis. So thank you very much, Roderick. I hope I didn't take up 30 minutes of my time. And on that note, I also want to thank my colleagues whom you cannot see, but I believe are online somewhere, for their support in putting this together. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Rita. Let me look and see if there are any questions that we have. Maybe what we'll do, Rita, is I'm sure that people will have questions. Let me just ask in terms of awareness or creating awareness outside of the bank in terms of what the ACCF is doing, what are some things that you do in order to create awareness so that both in terms of the fund as well as in terms of the importance of climate change, because when you talk about readiness, adaptation and mitigation and capacity building, for those of us that aren't steeped in climate finance, it may not be evident what some of those things are. So how do you think about that? I'll throw that out as the first question.
Okay, thank you very much, Roderick, for breaking the ice on the questions. So we have several avenues, and not surprisingly, the fund is quite popular. I can tell you that from the second call for proposal, I believe we had more than 1,000 project proposals, and we couldn't fund all of them, unfortunately. But in terms of outreach and partnerships, we use the climate change conferences, which is annual, as you know it. We use those platforms to really speak about the fund, the important work of the fund, and also share what the fund has been able to achieve. So we use a myriad of approaches to really share information about the fund. We also have a web page on the bank's website, which is a bit outdated, but we are working on having a full-fledged website for the fund, which will have all the adequate information that anybody looking for information can find. And you mentioned, I think there was a second part to your question about what do people think about climate change issues?
Yes.
I think we are the point where, and this is my opinion, we are the point where we increasingly are seeing evidence of climate change everywhere. So people who don't even know the terminologies will explain it like in layman terms. So more and more, it's becoming a subject that is well known across board. Of course, the people who access our funds are most often people who already are familiar with issues on climate resilience, and so most of the projects we receive channel well, if I may call it, these information, climate change information, as well as how strategies that these projects that apply to us are saying they can use to help in the individual countries that you're operating in. So I think on the subject of climate change, even at the bank, maybe before wasn't well known, but now it's something that we talk about often, and increasingly it's becoming a common terminology everywhere.
Okay, listen, Rita, we have a couple of questions that have come through on the question and answer icon. The first is, what is the form of support that goes to national institutions to get accredited?
Okay. All right, it's from Burgess, one of my colleagues.
Okay.
The project will have some of the projects, for instance, if I may mention one recent one, which was approved in under the second call for proposals. The approach is to have training of trainers for the government institutions as well as stakeholders within the project countries. And the focus sometimes is hiring a consultant who is steeped in the processes of getting accreditation with the GCF, etc., to provide step-by-step guidance and training to government entities and government counterparts. So that is one way in which this support is given to countries to be able to directly access or get accredited to the GCF. So the fund gives financial support to help them prepare the needed documentation, the appraisals that are required internally for them to be able to do this, to access the Green Climate Change Fund, for instance. There is another question.
Yeah, so maybe we'll put the next two together. So one is, can you recap?
Okay.
Can you, okay, that one disappeared. How many agricultural adaptation projects have you had come through the fund so far?
Okay, and then the second one, I think I can go to that. Okay, so do you want me to answer the question from Jeff on the how many?
Yeah, go ahead and answer Jeff, and then we'll get to the next one.
Okay, we have a few. Actually, we have a number of projects, particularly from the first call for proposals. On top of my head, I want to navigate back to the map I showed. Here we have, for instance, we have one in Côte d'Ivoire, which is being supported through the adaptation benefits mechanism to support cocoa farmers to enhance resilience. So that is one of such projects. We also have a project in Mali, which is also supporting the development of a project proposal for accessing adaptation funds, for accessing funds from the adaptation fund. And it's also focused on climate smart agriculture. There is also within the NDC support project, there is a project in Cameroon and also in, I believe in Namibia and Uganda, which are also focused on, I think, climate, peri-urban, for Uganda, peri-urban climate change, climate agriculture related projects. And in Cameroon, also looking at a climate change, an agricultural forestry project also. So these are some of a few examples on top of my head. There is also one project in Sudan, which is being implemented by an NGO. And they are also working with communities to build resilience into agricultural systems there. So those are a few examples that I can mention, but I'm happy to share more details on the project by project basis with whoever is interested. Yeah.
Rita, there was another question from Jeffrey as well, which was, can you recap on the kind of support you're looking for from task managers and how you interact with in the regions and country offices?
Mm-hmm. Okay, so for the kind of support, I mentioned that there are two groups of eligible beneficiaries. We have the internal beneficiaries who are bank departments. So when you apply as a tax manager to the ACCF, we expect you to be the tax manager for that project when it's approved. So you go through the process, you manage it on a day-to-day basis, you liaise with the secretariat to do all the issues related to processing funding, ensuring that the project activities get done. So that's on the one side. And for the external projects, this is something we've been struggling with, and I believe it's one approach now is to, if I may use the example of Sudan, we have a tax manager who is based in the regional office in Nairobi, and her focus also, her jurisdiction includes Sudan. So we kind of strike that agreement with her and the department and signed an MOU. And this is also I guess the new additions and new innovations we are trying, it's to get some sort of a firm commitment from the tax manager to manage the project. Of course, for those external projects, you have the people implementing it on the ground. You, the tax manager, liaise between them and then the secretariat. So there are various layers to this. So I hope I've answered Jeffrey's question on that.
Okay, listen, two more questions. One is, in terms of access, is it possible to access the ACC fund as a part of a RMC loan project with the ACCF serving as a grant component to and included in program design and appraisal processes?
Yes, I think this is possible, but also bear in mind that up until now we've been doing calls for proposals, so it's often for a limited period. So once the calls for proposals get closed, depending on the timing of your project, we may not be able to fund it, but we are hoping with the new window that we want to open, with the demand-driven window, we will be able to provide such support. But then again, it has to comply with the areas of interventions of the ACCF.
Okay, listen, I think the next question was one about is the case that projects can access the ACCF only through call for proposals. I think you mentioned already that that's primarily been the route, but there's going to be a new process set up that's coming. And so then let me just ask you one last question then, Rita, before we turn to Leandro. Can you provide support to infrastructure projects taking on board financing for adaptation and mitigation components within a project?
Okay. Ideally, okay. Can I take this question? Can this person contact us? Because I would like to have a one-on-one on this particular one. We have a multinational project, and looking at the slide here, which is a project on building climate resilience into a transboundary infrastructure project. So what he's describing sort of fits into that narrative, but it would be good to also have this discussion one-on-one to provide clear answers.
Okay.
So thank you, Roderick, and over to you, Leandro.
Okay, so we'll ask the person who asked the last question to contact Rita directly. Thank you. Listen, thank you very much, Rita. That was very informative. Leandro, we'll turn it over to you.
Okay, let me stop sharing. Okay, you have access now.
Thank you, Roderick. Let me just please share my presentation. It's here. Roderick, can you see the presentation in full screen?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, thank you. So good morning, good afternoon to everyone. My name is Leandro Azevedo. I'm the Principal Climate Finance Officer and the coordinator of the Climate Investment Funds at BCG1, which sits under the energy complex of the African Development Bank. I've been the coordinator of the CIF for the last 4 years, and we are currently a team that includes myself and around 4 consultants. And we together form the CIF coordination unit in the bank, which basically tries to coordinate all CIF activities within the bank, but also in delivering on the obligations of the African Development Bank to the CIF donors. And we also represent the bank in the various CIF governing bodies, which are basically the decision makers of everything that is CIF related. I will start by going through the content very quickly.
Hey, Leandro.
Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt, but if you can put your screen on display, because we see the notes on. So I think you need to change the. Yeah, that's better.
Okay.
Perfect.
So very quickly, the content is a bit different from the template we were provided. This is in part due to the fact of where the CIF stands at the moment in terms of implementation of the resources that were committed by the various donors. I'll go through this a little bit during the presentation, but basically we'll be discussing a little bit about what are the donors, the key areas of intervention, what are the existing programs at the moment, the new ones that will hopefully come in the near future. We'll dwell also a little bit on the governance structure, and then take a look at the portfolio and also our pipeline, and showcase a few examples of successful operations. I'll try to be brief so that we can have some more time for Q&As. But just so basically, the CIF, it's not a trust fund in the bank. In fact, it is a financial intermediary fund at the World Bank, for which external entities such as the African Development Bank can become an implementing agency. Other notable examples in the bank include the Global Environment Facility and more recently the WE5 fund. So as you can see in this slide, we became an implementing agency in 2010. The fund benefited from commitments from various donors in the tune of 8.1 billion. And the objective of the fund is really to contribute to transformational change in developing and emerging economies through the support of mitigation and adaptation projects. You can see in the areas of intervention that the CIF can support various kinds of sectors, technologies and activities, financial instruments as well, are very broad. We had provide preparation grants for projects, but also concessional debt and concessional equity for both sovereign and non-sovereign operations. Guarantees can also be possible, even though we haven't deployed any with the support of the CIF. And the eligibility kind of criteria, it's basically countries that have submitted expressions of interest to become part of the various CIF programs or funds, and were selected after a competitive process. This is the key way in which countries, African countries, can access funds from the CIF, whether then those resources are allocated to the public or private sector. Later on in the implementation of the CIF, donors decided to create some ad hoc programs. One of them was the dedicated private sector program, to ensure that more resources were allocated to the private sector program, as one of the lessons during the first years was that most of the financing was going through national governments and entities. Very quickly, the CIF, it's basically divided into two funds. The first and largest is the Clean Technology Fund. And then we have two programs under the Strategic Climate Fund, the Scaling Up Renewable Energy Program in low-income countries, the Pilot Program for Climate Resilience, and the Forest Investment Program. These are the four programs at the moment for which countries can benefit after they go successfully through that competitive selection process. This slide shows globally where the resources are going. You can see that Africa is the second largest region behind Asia in terms of the funds, the CIF funds it has received. This information is as of December 2019. You also see below the logos of the other implementing entities. So collectively, we are the ones implementing those resources. And we also see the breakdown of 75% between public sector and private sector. The fact that Asia has 31%, it's mainly due to the fact that they have access only or to a large majority funds under the Clean Technology Fund, which ultimate goal is really to finance interventions that lead to significant savings in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. Even though we have done some major investments as well into the CTF in Africa, the potential for those greenhouse gas emissions in Africa are much smaller when compared to more developed regions in the world. And so I would say this second place is somewhat justifiable. Just basically on this slide, you see the donor contributions, $1.1 billion roughly. There has been some small contributions since June 30, 2015, but those are very residual. You can see that the UK, the US, and Japan are the three largest contributors. This is significant, especially because the GCF became operational, the Green Climate Fund became operational in 2016. And immediately we felt that somewhat donors start seeing the climate investment funds as a facility that could somewhat be duplicating what the GCF was supposed to do. And since then, contributions have been very, very low. And MDBs or the implementing agencies have since then really focusing only on implementing the existing pipelines so that we can utilize the equal amount of funds under the CIF. As you know as well, the current political situation in the US might be also affecting those figures, and also the Japan position on whether adding additional contributions. It is worth saying that the UK has really been the prosecutor of the CIF. At the time of inception, donors came together because they felt they needed an intermediary solution to start allocating resources into the climate change space up and until the Green Climate Fund would be set up, which, as I said, happened in 2016. And that's why the CIF were created, to somehow address those issues as United Nations will continue working together to come to an agreement on the establishment of the Green Climate Fund. Quickly on the programs, here you can see a description, a broad description of each fund. I won't go too much into detail on those. The slide is self-explanatory. The CIF and the STRAP are mainly focusing on mitigation, whereas the Forest Investment Program is mainly mitigation, but also adaptation, and the pilot program for climate resilience, mainly on climate resilience activities across the pilot countries. Important to say, as recently there has been an effort from the various CIF stakeholders, also in responding to requests from the various governing bodies to try to develop new programs that somehow would provide support to areas for which the Green Climate Fund it's not clearly perceived to be provided. And so over the last couple of years, all MDBs together with the donors and the CIF admin unit at the World Bank have been working together on these 4 programs. One of it is on integration of renewable energy into power systems program. The other one on accelerating low carbon climate resilient transition in industry program. This is mainly a private sector program that will be deployed. And then we have one for nature, people and climate investments program, which is really broad and will mainly focus on climate adaptation, which is really where the need is in the continent. And then the final program on climate smart urbanization program. We have developed design documents for these 4 programs. I can make them available to you if you are interested. At the moment, the programs are not yet capitalized, and the understanding from the MDBs and the CIF admin unit is that we will need at least to receive a capitalization of around $500 million per program before we can consider starting implementation. I mentioned before that, in addition to the investment plans and to respond to some priorities from donors, we have developed some ad hoc programs. At the moment, we will be starting implementation of the dedicated private sector program number 4 for battery storage, and this is independent of the programs I mentioned in my previous slides, and for which there are around $300 million. Out of that amount, AIDB will be implementing around $80 million. We have already worked with the various regions, especially the energy sector colleagues, to identify a pipeline of both public and private sector projects. That said, we are still in the process of accepting additional concept notes for projects that can be readier to move forward through the bank's internal review and approval process. So we'll continue monitoring the bank's pipeline in the energy sector to see if we can, if one project is moving faster than others, to see if we can allocate resources. The objective, of course, will be to really to fully utilize our $80 million allocation. And then, as you can see, the second one, the PPCR business development facility for the PPCR, much smaller amounts, $2.49 million, and it's basically funds for grant funding for project preparation of projects and or to implement technical assistance with the climate resilience focus in PPCR pilot countries. We have already submitted the pipeline of projects for months, and we'll now start developing those projects and work to seek approval internally in the near future. Under the new programs, so the ones I've mentioned in this one here, there's at the moment, and this is something we are starting now, so as soon as we get those contributions, and let me be clear that at this stage those are not yet confirmed, and I think it will depend on a number of factors, but really on donor interest. There's been some promising feedback we have received from some countries, but we'll continue reassessing this. I think you know, the world post-COVID-19 might change a bit the priorities of donor countries, so it is still a bit too early to know whether those contributions will, and if they will, when be made. But basically, so you know, we will set up together with the CIF admin unit a group of independent experts that will basically analyze and rank the expressions of interest received by countries. And so any country that has an interest in any of the programs will have to come up with these EOIs in which they will explain why the country should have access or should be selected as a pilot country to become recipients of those funds. Obviously, AIDB will reporting countries, interested countries in preparing those EOIs. But as soon as this process is finalized, then the group will make recommendations to the governing body for a final decision. Once this is done, we'll basically then start another intelligent preparation of another investment plan. The step that precedes that implementation of projects, which includes obviously deployment of financing. On the governance structure, so just for to have, you know, I try to make this as simply as possible. So you can see on that, those that work to set up the climate investment funds. So donors, together with the CIF admin unit, came up with design documents. Not only the CIF admin unit, but also model bank consultant at that time to come up with the design documents. And so, yeah, we've set up the climate investment fund. So the trustee received the contribution from the donors, and then pursued financial years agreements with the various multilateral development banks, including ourselves. That's when we, in 2010, signed those, and effectively came an implementing agency able to deploy resources to the recipient countries. The CIF admin unit, the same way we, the CIF coordination unit at the bank, plays a coordination role between the bank as an institution and the operational departments. And obviously the CIF admin unit and the donors. The CIF admin unit does a little bit the same, but it engages with all the multilateral development banks, the donors, but also other various stakeholders, including observers, recipient countries, obviously. So they are also instrumental in making sure that the governance works well, and that contributions continue coming. So in very shortly, this is the governance we have at the moment. It's it can change over time, especially now with the new programs. But for now, that's what we have. Just quickly on our portfolio, as you can see, we have 27 countries that are pilot countries in Africa. You see on the left countries highlighted with various colors. Yellow is for PPCR, light blue, for example, is for the CTF. At the moment, we have 26 AIDB CIF-approved projects for a total of around $817 million from CIF resources. This entails projects that the bank co-finance in the tune of around 1.9 billion. On the right downside, you can see the disbursement rates. Not surprisingly, CTF has a disbursement rate of around 76%. This it's in nature due to the fact that those pilot countries in Africa have, what I would say, in my view, a better absorption capacity than many of the others. The PPCR countries are doing extremely well as well. The SREP not so much, but it is worth noting that SREP was established later than the other programs, and we are facing some serious challenges in implementations of some of those projects, which are delaying implementation. You can see that AIDB, the breakdown between public and private, is still below the global average, and so we are doing an effort to increase our participation in private sector. The dedicated private program that I mentioned on battery storage will help increase that share. The previous dedicated private sector programs also played a key role in bringing us together to the global average. But these are substantial amounts that the bank has deployed and is deploying still around the continent on climate change. Very quickly, this is our existing pipeline. It's around $200 million. On the right side, you can see expected approval dates at the CIF level. That approval precedes our own board approval. Currently, the projects that are likely to move faster are the two SREP projects in Ghana. We expect those projects to be approved by our board of directors early next year, and we'll be seeking approval from the CIF governing body in the coming months. We see still a contribution of $10 million for the Africa Renewable Energy Fund 2. This has been approved this month. We still have to update this table, but what you can see from here is that many of those projects are projects that were included many years ago in the investment plans, but for various reasons didn't progress to implementation due to apologies, due to prioritization of, or different prioritization of banks financing in the various countries. So just for you to have an idea, in Uganda we had around $25 million for renewable energy projects. These were highly concessional projects. But as soon as the investment plan got approved, the government of Uganda decided to prioritize banks financing into the transport sector, and as a result, the country lost these funds and the resources were allocated to other projects elsewhere. Very quickly, some examples of successful operations, and then I will end here. I would start with the Noor concentrated solar power complex in Morocco. This is the largest program, the largest project in the CIF. CIF has deployed around $220 million and the bank around $750 million into this project. This is really a flagship project for the bank, and you know, if you have a chance to visit it, is quite amazing what Morocco was able to do with it. And the targets that you see in the slides speak by themselves. We've also provided financing to the first public-private partnership, the bank finance in the forest space. It was a project in Ghana. The bank provided around $14 million, with the state providing $10 million. This is basically restoring degraded forest reserves in the country in a commercial manner, allowing for private investors to come in and to put their own money in those activities, and basically you know, plant more trees in the country. As you know, Ghana suffers a lot from forest degradation and destruction, and forest reserves, the status of those forest reserves throughout the country. It's really bad. It's been really bad for over the last few decades. So we hope this is the first of many projects. We will continue to work with different countries and see whether we can allocate resources under the new programs into forestry. The last one, it's in Mozambique. It's about sustainable land and water resource management. We have developed some reports that really go into detail on what has been achieved with the project, and we can share those with you so that you have a better idea of what the bank is doing in Mozambique in terms of climate resilience. As you know, Mozambique is highly exposed to climate change risk, and BPCR and the CIF have played an amazing role in the country, supporting them in mitigating some of those risks, whether with smart agriculture, whether building roads that are pro-flooding, and you know, we really hope that more will come in the near future. So I'll stop here. Thank you. I'm happy to respond to any questions you might have.
Leandro, thank you. That was very informative and helpful. Let's just go straight to the questions. We have one question about, could you broadly highlight what support you could provide to a city municipality that is trying to set up a cable car transport system as a private sector investment?
Thank you, Roderick. In fact, we have just approved, or we submit a funding request to under the Clean Technology Fund of $20 million to finance the Lagos Cable Car project, a energy efficiency project. We received approval for that. So, at the moment, basically, our transport colleagues are working with the government and also the private promoter to try to accelerate the project towards financial close. It is a challenging project. It has been in the bank since 2011, if I'm not mistaken. It dropped out from our pipelines at a certain moment and then came back. This time around, we think there's a real interest and a real commitment from the government to mitigate some of the risk. And so we expect this to be a good example of the kind of support the CIF and the bank as well can provide in that space. There's obviously a learning curve internally. What I can say is that at the moment, under the existing programs, the existing funds, the bank is enabled to tap into additional resources from the CIF into these kind of projects. Assuming the new programs get capitalized, and you have seen that one of the programs is on urban development, as soon as these programs get capitalized, and countries where this kind of infrastructure is a priority decide to apply to the program, then we can work together with the other multilateral development banks, the CIF admin unit, and those countries to make sure that those projects can be included in the pipeline.
Okay. Listen, another question, Leandro, is what are lessons learned from other MDB's engagement with the CIF? Obviously, it's the Asian Development Bank that is leading in terms of the number of projects, and we certainly are not far behind. But are there any lessons learned from either the ADB or IADB in terms of engaging with the CIF, so that we could take that number to even more?
Yeah, no, definitely, Roderick. I think the CIF is a partnership between the MDBs and the CIF admin unit. Sorry, we have what we call the MDB committees across the various funds. We are all observers in the governing bodies. We all have a chance to take a look at the review and approval process from all these institutions. And so, as we also work together in drafting most of the documents that are presented to the governing bodies, this provides us a chance to take a look at the various projects and programs that are being proposed elsewhere. I can give you an example. I think with the Inter-American Development Bank, we've learned a lot in terms of how to use those resources for financial intermediation. I think this lets us in part to be successful with the support we provided to the Facility for Energy Inclusion. Also recently to the African Renewable Energy Fund too. And we are now also working on a line of credit with the Commercial Bank of Ethiopia. And some of the challenges we face sometimes in deploying resources across the private sector is on how to justify the principle of minimum concessionality, right? How we ensure we are not over subsidizing those recipients, and we are not creating any market distortion as a result. So with the Inter-American Development Bank and most of the financing they deploy in the form of financial intermediation, it has been really productive and rewarding to see how they approach this. I think as an institution, they are still a step ahead of the African Development Bank. And so all in all, I think there are many lessons to learn. This obviously doesn't go only one way. There have been many lessons that other colleagues in other banks also learned with us. I think our investments in geothermal in Kenya are a good example. We've been contacted by the World Bank on a number of occasions to learn with that operation, the Asian Development Bank as well. But stepping back a little bit, you know, the fact that the Asian Development Bank has deployed an higher amount doesn't mean they have a larger number of projects. In fact, it's the other way around. AFDB is obviously the World Bank, which has a global footprint, so they are involved in pretty much all the regions as the larger portfolio in number of projects. AFDB second, but you know, under the Clean Technology Fund, which had around $5.5 billion, the individual projects had a size of a certain magnitude that the other programs don't have. So, and you could see in the map that most of our pilot countries are in low-income countries. Those are smaller amounts. We have projects of around $5 million, $6 million, $7 million, and those require pretty much the same amount of work in terms of the bank going through the safeguards and making sure that those projects you know, meet all requirements in terms of project quality and implementation modalities. I'll stop here.
So we have a number of other questions. I'll just go straight down the list. In terms of climate resilience, would CIF consider funding multi-regional projects for improving access and use of heat-tolerant crops / seeds?
Yeah, we would. In fact, you know, there has been a number of regional investment plans that were developed with the CIF and with other programs. One of them was the MENA region concentrated solar power program. And here I'm giving an example of mitigation, not adaptation, but my point is that we can consider regional programs. So if you look in the presentation on the new programs, the one under nature, people and climate investment programs, which will mainly focus on adaptation, there is an interest, I would say, from donors and from the CIF admin unit as well, that some countries can come up together with a regional investment plan that looks a bit beyond their own country. Also because many of those issues are regional in nature. And if you look at water resource management, you know, whatever decisions a country might make upstream might have an impact downstream. And so there has been some discussions with some countries for eventually a regional program. This will be considered further down the road once the contributions are made by donors and the expression of interest process starts.
Okay, next question. I'm going to bunch these two together. There was just one. Can you share more documentation or information on eligibility for the new program for nature, people, and climate investments? And then similarly, just can you elaborate on the 500 million capitalization need for the new CIF programs?
Yeah. So on the eligibility, what I'll do is I'll send the latest version of the document to firm, and then you know, you guys can submit it to the participants. I will need some minutes to find the document now and share it with you, but if we have time, I can still do that. And you know, in there you will see a detailed description of the process. On the $500 million, you know, this is an amount that MDBs, so AIDB and the others, felt it would be an acceptable amount to mobilize our teams to go through the expression of interest process, and you know, these are time-consuming processes that demand a lot from our technical experts, not only the CIF admin unit. So if we would be looking into an expression of interest focusing on the integration of renewable energy, we really need to mobilize our energy sector colleagues to go into the country, engage with other MDBs, engage with various stakeholders, engage with the countries, support them in writing those investment plans, which can be significant documents, and then really come up with a pipeline. So all in all, this is a process that can take up to 1 year or more. And by the end of it, you have not deployed any funds, right? And we are a financial institution, a development financial institution, and we need to use our resources accordingly, and basically try to maximize the amount of resources we deploy on an annual basis to our regional member countries. So, you know, over the last years as well, you know, and many of the existing programs, you know, they felt, you know, many issues with resource availability. And as I said, you know, we have seen some donors making small contributions, but when you have 6 MDBs deploying resources, $100 million is nothing. So we really need some size in terms of the contributions so that it is worth for us collectively to engage in the programs. And since these are global, we cannot just say, okay, we'll pick 100 million and do projects in Africa only. No, we need to keep the global focus. 500 million might seem a lot of money in the context of the CIF or other kind of funds, but it isn't. Just for you to have an idea, in the North CSP program, AIDB wasn't the only MDB involved. The World Bank was also involved. And just into operations, you know, around $400 million were spent. So we need some scale, and we need to have some visibility on the confirmation of those funds before we can engage and take these new programs to the next step.
Okay, thank you, Leandro. 3 more questions. What is the main selection criteria for the countries to access resources under the new PPCR? Criteria for the last one was to be among the most vulnerable countries.
So the expressions of interest and that document that I will share with you goes into what they call criteria for each program. Obviously, vulnerability for the Nature, People and Climate Investments program will be a key criteria for the selection of countries. But the document outlines in detail what are the criteria that the expressions of interest must respond to. Vulnerability, again, it's critical, and I would say that African low-income countries are very well placed to get a seat at the table and really receive those funds when compared to other regions.
And then, Leandro, let me lump these 2 together. The first kind of overarching is, what is the comparative advantage of the CIF, if any, for assisting the bank to meet our own climate change objectives in RMCs? And for example, when should a bank project task team seek out CIF resources as opposed to those from GCF, GEF, or other facilities? And then similarly, just in terms of the utilization of funds, could the CIF be utilized in support of captive power plants, for example, in the manufacturing or mining sectors?
Okay, I might have to come back to you for some of those, but
Okay.
let me address the last one. So on captive power plants. You know, if those captive power plants deploy the renewable energy technology, they would in principle be eligible under the Clean Technology Fund or the Scaling of Renewable Energy Program. That meant that at the time the investment plans were developed for all the pilot countries in Africa, and this is something that happened 5-6 years ago, those projects would have to be prioritized at the national level so that they could benefit from that funding. Now you will recall that during my presentation I said that, you know, after some years of implementation of the funds, donors felt that there was not enough private sector investments, right? And so they allocated pockets of funds into other programs. And to give you an example, under the CIF, there were these dedicated private sector programs. And under these programs, it was relatively easy to pick or to select projects, let's say, in our pipeline that would meet the broad investment criteria of those programs, and seek to deploy concessional finance. As you know, or as you may know, there's no such programs at the moment, other than the DPSP4, which is on battery storage, for which there are $300 million. So if that captive power plant project would be in a country that is a CIF pilot country, so for example, Ghana, Mali, wherever, we would need to take a look at the list. If it would be, for example, in Guinea, we couldn't do it because Guinea is not a pilot country. But if there was some form of battery storage component associated with that project, we could take a look and potentially consider financing or using CTF into that. But that would obviously depend on the technology you are using, on the readiness of the project, on whether the bank is considering financing to that project, where we stand in terms of readiness, because, you know, there is an expectation from donors that the banks implement those resources as quickly as possible. So we cannot afford get involved and somehow lock in funds to a project that is at a very early stage in its development phase, and then for 3 or 4 years those resources or even internal approval move nowhere. So you know, this is something we do very often. We assess projects on a case-by-case basis. So my call to colleagues in operations is that, you know, when they believe they have a project that might meet the criteria of the various programs, that they can call and reach out to us so that we can provide that. On the first question, so, and how the CIF resources actually contribute to the bank's overall climate finance targets. You know, again, the bank became an implementing entity in 2010. You know, this was after our largest investment in a coal project in South Africa, which, if I'm not mistaken, is still the largest project in the bank. And we did analysis recently, and we realized that after that project in South Africa, which, you know, due to its technology, the bank has never done again any deployed again financing in the coal sector in the country, and most of the financing in the energy sector, which is really one of the key sectors of the bank. South Africa, which in its turn is one of our main clients, have been mainly in energy involvement. And the CIF has been involved in most of those transactions. So I would say, you know, the fact that those are resources that use together with its own resources. Serves a little bit as a sweet for us as a financial development institution to become more involved in this kind of stuff. And you know, I have to say that you cannot change that overnight. There is learning happening in the bank. Obviously, you see that operational departments are more and more familiar with those kind of facilities, not only the CIF but also the JEF and the GCF and others. You know, most importantly, you know, I think it's clear now that our shareholders and our donors are increasingly paying more attention to climate change. They made formal commitments at the United Nations level on climate change. Donors and investors in the bank, for them, this is a priority. And if you go and you take a look at the GCI paper and the last ADF replenishment report, climate change comes out very strongly there. And so I think all in all, you know, these facilities have placed the bank in a path towards becoming more climate change friendly, and it will continue. In terms of the target, which is $25 billion by 2025, if I'm not mistaken, of our total approvals, you know, there is only so much the CIF can make. It will really depend on the amount of available financing and whether donors will make new commitments to the CIF. That said, and assuming that those commitments will not come, you know, the bank will have to continue engaging with the GCF and to increasingly mobilize higher and higher amounts to make sure that the bank can use those funds together with its own funds and continue providing the support with a certain scale and magnitude to our regional member countries. The second question, if I may have your help. Roderick, is that?
Yeah, I think that's, I think you answered it.
Okay.
Leandro.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Listen, Leandro, thank you very much for your discussion and for your presentation. Rita, thank you as well. Just as a final question to both of you, given that we're at the end of our climate finance section or series, how do the various funds, if at all, work together or complement each other in the department?
Rita, you want to go first?
Okay. Yeah. So thank you for the question, Roderick. And my response to that is that we can look at it from two levels. And this is, I will share examples of projects that we are doing that really respond to that. Internally, as I mentioned in the presentation, the bank departments can access funding from the ACCF to develop bankable proposals. So for instance, when the good side to it is that we also have the GCF, that is the bank is accredited to, the adaptation fund that the bank is accredited to. Of course, there are some, Ayanle, I think last week shared that there are some issues with accessing resources from adaptation fund, but let me focus on the GCF then. So if the bank is able to do this, and it has with, for instance, with our colleagues from the GCF team, they've been able to access funding from ACCF to develop a multinational infrastructure project. And the idea is that this project, where it's at now, is supposed to be submitted through the bank to the GCF. So that is one way. So we kind of use this preparatory resources from the ACCF to support the bank to develop a proposal and submit it through itself as an accredited entity to the GCF. And then on the other hand, and this is something that we need to also maybe explore more, we have all these project proposals, concept notes that are being developed through our external projects and external project implementation teams. And often they submit them through accredited entities within their countries. So that is one way, but in cases where maybe they are also looking widely, they can also package the proposals, the concept notes into a proposal that the bank in itself can also take on and submit. So I'm sharing these, the second part we're not doing so much of, but for our own internal projects, which the ACCF support, we are doing something, and I've shared the example of the multinational infrastructure project. So I think there's room to do more, and I hope that more and more we can look at these synergies within ourselves. Thank you.
I'll probably be a bit less political than Rita on this one. I think you know, and I'll focus more on the CIF, the GEF, and the GCF, and not so much on the ACCF. I think the ACCF can really play a valuable role in the early stages of project development, in supporting national actors to really prioritize projects and activities in those critical sectors. But you know, I'll focus on the GEF, the CIF, and the GCF for the simple reason that it's where you are seeing the more substantial amounts being deployed at the project level in the bank. And you know, the reality is that those three funds are very different from one another, even though they seek to promote or to meet the same overarching goals. However, donors over time, or the governing bodies or the governing bodies of each respective fund, change things in manners that they seem were the best moving forward. You know, I'd just say that, you know, as soon as the GCF was created, what we felt in the CIF was that donors were not that much interested anymore to provide funds into the CIF because they felt they would be duplicating their efforts. Now, you know, donor countries made serious commitments to the GCF in terms of investments, which they are very unlikely to meet in the next years, right? And so this duplication of efforts claim they put out there, it's only political because we need more resources. We do not need less resources. But you know, at the same time, they shield themselves on the fact that, you know, the CIF is doing the same as the GCF. No, the GCF is doing the same as the CIF because the CIF was already established for more than 8 years once the GCF came. So what's happening now is that CIF is restructuring itself to try to provide this justification to donor countries that the CIF is doing something different, right? And with that, trying to attract at least those $500 million for each program that I presented early on. Now, if I receive an email from a colleague with a project idea, you know, requesting whether there could be potential for CIF involvement, and you know, yesterday we received one request for Guinea, for example. My response was very simple. Listen, Guinea is not a country, and so the CIF cannot support, but you know, you should consult with my colleagues in the GEF and the GCF because maybe they have the resources to support you. Now, me as CIF coordinator, I'm unable to provide that response because on one side we have you know, more than 60 projects active between technical assistance grants and investment projects. We have our obligations in terms of reporting to the donors and to the CIF admin unit, themselves on their end the same. And so it becomes really hard to have a detailed understanding of all the variables of each facility and really be able to jump from one into another. So I think to a large extent, that is why we have various coordination units within our division, each one managed by a colleague that keeps track of, you know, all the decisions from the governing bodies on an ongoing basis. And, you know, I can tell you and confirm to you that those change very quickly. And sometimes something that is a rule stops being a rule and is not information you can find on our internal file system because those are all decided outside. So it's challenging. It's very challenging for these facilities to coordinate effectively with one another because while they try to meet the same objectives to a large extent, they are very different on their organization and how they deploy funds.
Listen, thank you, Rita and Leandro. That was very, very informative. So thank you again for your participation, and please send our regards to your colleagues. For everyone on the line, I'll just note that this Thursday, we have another brown bag. This time kicking off the series with financial sector development trust funds. We have the Africa Digital Finance Trust Fund, as well as the Capital Market Development Trust Fund that will be presenting. So with that, I'll say thank you again to Leandro and to Rita and to all of the participants on the call.